Now it is my pleasure to invite Stephane Berghmans, who is the Director of Research and Innovation at EUA, to tell us more about the survey and tell us more about what he's recommending to the sector.
What I'm recommending, what EUA is
we
recommending.
Personalize all of these things, Stephane.
Thank you very much, Michael. Wonderful. Perfect. Thank you. Great. What a crowd. Yesterday I was excited just by the rehearsal. Now I've got people in front of me. It's amazing. Wonderful. So good to see you all, and thank you so much for coming. As Michael just said, indeed, I'll be talking about the results, but I just want to make clear, I'll be talking about a selection of the results of the EUA survey on universities and innovation. And that's because, to be very honest, in the next 20-25 minutes, I just don't have the time to present everything. Not just that. Yes, you can go and find, with a QR code, my presentation there, where you will see the selected questions. But in early 2022, we will come back to you with an in-depth report that will be contextualized also with success stories, actually, from the survey. So that's important. It's a selection. It's not everything. The rest is coming very soon. Before I start with the survey, I want to highlight that we might all agree today that indeed innovation is much more a focus of universities than it has been in the past decades. And I think that what we're missing, though, is a body of evidence to show us what is the picture in Europe of what universities are doing in terms of innovation. So that's why, with the EUA expert group on innovation ecosystem, we've got several members represented here and even a past member with us today, we set out to do a survey. And what we wanted to find out is what was the strategic attention that universities were paying to innovation. And then also, we wanted to put that in connection with the innovation capacity that university had and see if there were any gaps that were present. The other thing we wanted to look into is, Michael told you about this previous report we did with case studies of 9 universities. We had identified that the actors in the ecosystem see universities as honest brokers. And so we wanted to investigate that too. Before I move on to the survey, I just want to highlight also that, yes, innovation, as Michael highlighted, is indeed at EUA a process of knowledge co-creation and transfer for the economy, but not only. He mentioned social, environmental, cultural innovation also as being other important elements, and they're not the only ones. You have a list here of examples of innovation taking place at universities. I don't have the time to go into it, but you'll have that to read. No need to repeat it, 166. I think it's a wonderful number for a first ever survey on innovation at universities. And you can see here the split. We can see that in Italy, for example, in Spain, we had quite a big number of responses. It's a bit unfair because really, for example, Belgium has less universities, and yet about 50% of all the universities in Belgium answered. In Iceland, for example, 75%. So just keep that in mind when you look at those results. Importantly, the profile of the institutions here. The vast majority, 70%, are actually comprehensive universities. But we also had a very good proportion of the technical universities as well as universities of applied science. And a small proportion, there's less of course, of specialist institution also. So let me now move on to the survey itself and the first section, which was about the capacity that universities have in innovation. So the first question we set out to ask was, does your institution have a strategy or a mission statement that reflects its innovation agenda? And as was highlighted by Michael, but also by the commissioner, it's overwhelmingly yes. 74% say yes, and you can see that there's an additional 23% that say no, but they're in process of developing that or updating their strategy. So clearly here we're talking about 93% that have actually or are working on a strategy for innovation. And again, that can take many different shapes and forms. It could be about social innovation, through contribution with collaboration, for example, to sustainable society. It's also about research, but it's also about learning and teaching. We've seen, oh, it's going faster than I expected. But it's also about learning and teaching with student innovation and entrepreneurship. So the next thing we wanted to look into is the assessment of the overall institutional strategic attention and the link with the innovation capacity that you have at universities. And we can see that 75% said that it was very high or high attention that they were paying to innovation. Good news. A bit less optimistic universities about their innovation capacity, and you can see that we're at 60%. So there is a gap between their vision, their strategy, and how much they can actually do. Where do the gaps come from? Well, Michael told you, 3. First, not enough space for co-creation. Second, not enough investment, sustainable funding. And finally, people, staff. It's both about being able to hire the staff, but then also how to motivate the staff at universities. And that's really about the incentives, making sure that innovation is incentivized at universities. So that's what we set out also to look into, is what sort of support, in this next question we were asking, what sort of support do academic staff this time receive to enhance the institutional innovation capacity? And on top you can see that yes, there's good support for commercialization of ideas and research results, but there's also dedicated services provided to support them. Good news. Unfortunately, when you go lower down in the responses, you can see that there's less actually presence at universities of incentives, for example, awards, career development, and worst case, career assessment. Only 33% of universities who responded have that within their career assessment system. So the problem is that today university staff and the innovation they do actually are not yet well recognized in the academic career assessment system. So that's one of the messages to keep in mind. We then set out to look at the framework conditions for enhancing university innovation capacity. And as we said before, staff, that's qualified teaching, research, and administrative staff. It's about funding, sufficient sustainable funding for innovation activities. And then of course, very important is the governance, but also institutional autonomy. You need to have institutional autonomy at universities to be able to do your mission in innovation. That's a key element too. Interestingly, what we're not showing, this is an open list here with other responses, is all the regulatory framework. We're talking about, state aid rules, procurement, regulation, is actually much lower down. So that's really not considered as important in terms of framework condition. Except for IP. IP regulation is right there at 84% below what we see here. And I've kept for the end the connections to global innovation communities, and importantly, the cooperation among different actors in the innovation ecosystem. That's because we looked in next what those partnerships are actually in the area of innovation. And what you're seeing is that universities are collaborating in innovation with local, regional, national, public sector institutions. Also with other universities in their own country and with research organizations. Unfortunately, the lesson from this slide is that when it comes to the private sector, it's much lower down. And it's even worse when we look at civil society organizations. So here, what we did is a correlation analysis. And we went back to the first questions and looked at those universities that specifically said they had a high attention on innovation. And when we look at them specifically, they collaborate much more with large companies and with civil society organizations. So again, another lessons to learn here. More attention to innovation, more collaboration with the private sector, as well as civil society. Finally, we looked at the funding sources for innovation at universities. And overwhelmingly, the response is, the biggest one is national competitive funding, followed at 71% with funding from regional government as well as Erasmus+. A first surprise, because we were not expecting Erasmus Plus to be there. But when you think about it, it makes sense. What does Erasmus Plus allow you to do? Collaborate with other universities, do learning and teaching. And we see, and we will see, that those are important elements to implement innovation at universities. So not so much of a surprise. More of a surprise is around the framework program and the different instruments. EIT, EIC are quite low actually. So maybe they're not well known enough still at universities. Understandable for EIC, certainly, and we can expect that in the coming years it will be better known. As Commissioner Gable mentioned, these two are important elements for the innovation agenda in Europe. And then of course different roles you see with the other ones right here. That was for the innovation capacity. Let me move on now to the twin transition. We know how important the twin transition is for Europe, for the future of Europe, even for the world, when you think about a green transition. So we specifically looked into the sustainable and the digital transition also in our survey. So starting with the sustainable transition, first we looked at the university contributions to innovation for a sustainable transition. And what we see is that the way they contribute is through actually developing new technologies through university research activity. So that's research. The next is actually about staff, people, and students, people. So back to people. It's about improving student and staff understanding of sustainability, but also competence to innovate. But in this list of response, I'll make the important point that you see the empty box there. That's because actually this is the bottom. There's other responses there, and that's the top 5. But we see stark contrast. Because at the top, research activity, as I mentioned, but at the bottom, changing consumer behaviors in society. So maybe there's a lesson to learn there for universities, is that they need to ensure balance between the technology and the social innovation. So that's one thing to remember. The other stark contrast is 70% answered that when it comes to existing infrastructure, they do reduction in the environmental impact of those infrastructures. But at 50% only, they talk about improving the resilience of the existing infrastructure. And here we're talking about probably universities needing to be more holistic in their approach because they need to support climate change mitigation and also adaptation. We then set out to look at university research and education activities in delivering innovation for a sustainable transition. And here, what we're seeing is that on top, we're seeing improving the transfer of research results to innovation, so research again, followed again with students that you see here, and down there with entrepreneurial training and improving students' awareness of innovation for sustainability. This is again about researchers, so research, students, learning and teaching, research present there. In an interesting third place, you've got interdisciplinarity. So very nice to see it there. The creation of interdisciplinary institutes actually at universities. The somewhat more sad part of this question is what we see here about citizen science. It's only down at 46% when we take very important that we see the presence of citizen science. So again, one of the lessons, the take-home message from this question is that there needs to be more support for widespread use of citizen science when it comes to innovation, specifically in the case of sustainable transition. We also set out to look at the indicators that universities use to measure their success when it comes to innovation in the sustainable transition. So you've got the list here, and I was honestly expecting to see patents at the top. Well, that's not what we see. What we see at the top are partnerships, number of partnerships for sustainability-related activities. Okay? Second, learning and teaching, number of study programs addressing sustainability in the curriculum, and also the number of graduates that you see there happening also. So interesting, again, you've got learning and teaching, so back to people and how that is important. Again, as I said, number of patent application is much lower. What's also much lower and somewhat disappointing is the nurturing of the startup sector for sustainable tech and not tech solution. So really, it raises a question. If it's not with the private sector that the partnerships that they're using as indicators are taking place, what sort of partnerships are we talking about? So we ran again a correlation analysis to find out which were those types of partnerships. And unfortunately, we see that it's mostly with other universities, research organization. It's also with civil society organization, as well as the national public sector institutions. So something to do there, as was said to the commissioner also by you, Michael, about more links with the private sector, especially in this case, sustainable transition. Let's move on to the digital transition, where here we first ask something about the challenges that universities are facing when it comes to innovation in the digital transition. And what you're seeing here, actually in the top 4, is, not surprisingly, as was mentioned before, funding. So funding in this case for technology adoption upgrades. It's about staff. It's staff both hiring of digitally skilled staff, but also uptake of digital skills among current staff. And then finally, it's about cybersecurity for the top 4 responses that you see there. And let's face it, this is important because while we hear a lot of talks about technology leadership at European level, you will not be able to achieve this unless you have capacity building first. This is all about capacity building at universities. So let's keep that in mind. The positive message, I think, that you see here in those results is what we see at the bottom. So it is not anymore so much a challenge for universities to find digital partners in the ecosystem. And it's not either a problem to cooperate with them. So very good news to see also from these results. We also set out to look for indicators in the success, how universities measure actually their success in the area of digital transition for innovation. And once again, you see that patents are much lower down, but the numbers of partnerships is again on top, with the number of study programs addressing digital innovation in the curriculum. We also see in this case that nurturing the startup sector for digital solutions is actually, even though the proportion is not higher, it's actually higher in its position. So it seems that in this area, there might be more collaboration with the private sector. We ran again a correlation analysis, and indeed in this case, universities do, for the digital transition when it comes to innovation, collaborate much more with SMEs. It was even the only significant correlation we could find in this case. So interesting result also that we see here. Finally, we asked a question about the enablers for innovation in the digital transition at universities. And I'm sorry to hit the nail so many times, but that's the reality of the survey, and that's why it's so important. It's about people. It's first about qualified staff. It's again sufficient and sustainable funding. Nice third place again here that you see with the interdisciplinarity. What's interesting in this one though is that all the more digitally oriented, more the technically oriented ones, such as access to more big data, for example, AI and big data governance, or computing capacities, are actually less seen as major enablers compared to the ones we've heard before about staff, funding, or in this case, interdisciplinarity. So those are the elements from this. So I'm done with the survey for now, but before I leave you, of course, I want to go back to the recommendations. I want to stress again what Michael said. These are recommendations not just for policymakers at national and European level, but also for funding agencies and for universities. So we do have 2 columns specifically for that. I want to insist. Then we also have recommendations for innovation capacity, and in my next slide you'll see for sustainable transition as well as for the digital transition. So I don't have the time to go through all the recommendations, of course. I just want to highlight again, because it was mentioned many times, the support universities in interacting with companies and other actors in the innovation ecosystem. I think Michael was very clear in mentioning that lowering the regulation burden, for example, allowing more opportunities for networks, giving incentives, providing advice, for example, skills development are key elements to allow this to happen at universities. And then looking at universities themselves, actually, we're talking about, for example, in this case, boosting the preparation of next generation of digital innovators. So this is really about entrepreneurship, but it goes beyond. It's really about broad skills. It needs to be a range of transversal skills that include, for example, interdisciplinarity. Oops, moving to, oh sorry, I had moved already. So that's interesting. I didn't even notice I was looking at you. The only one I would highlight then to finish is probably this one, which was also mentioned before in the slides and by Michael. It's about capacity building. I think it's quite important to understand that there needs to be a support for the adoption, but also the upgrading of technologies. And it's back also at staff. Being able to hire skilled staff is a key element for the success here. And then finally, of course, the staff that is at universities, we've heard in the results of the survey that it's about the uptake of digital skills when it comes to staff. So with that, I will stop. I will thank you very much for your attention. Look forward for the full report when it comes out in early 22. And in the meantime, you have the QR code to go and find the presentation. And I'll be happy to take a few questions before we move on then. Before we move on to this wonderful panel. Questions? Comments? It's been 2 years. People are not used to this anymore. And if you're worried, we've got Lenka with wipes so that she will wipe off the microphone if you take it in your hand. So don't worry about this. Okay? No comments? Nothing? No question? In that case, well, and I guess we can, yes? Sorry, Michael, I had not seen you.
I hate silences at the end of presentations. Stephane, that was very enjoyable. I have a question for you. On the measures of success slide, what struck me about it are that most of the elements listed are really inputs rather than outputs or impact of innovation efforts. Is work being done to try to come up with valid, measurable, real impacts on regional society arising from university engagement? I'm talking about being able to see impacts on employment, new types of jobs in a region, social gain. Has some thinking in that space?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that today, this morning, we had a meeting of the expert group, and we're thinking about the future agenda, and that's a question I will put to them. And maybe Peter, you can talk about that during the panel, because I think that, at least from my side, what I would answer is you're only as good as the data you have. So maybe today we're missing key data to be able to go beyond actually the input and see and look at the output. So maybe that's one thing that we need to think about for the future, is if we want to have other indicators, that will be a way to look. And I see that Peter is raising his hand, so he certainly wants to react to this.
So thank you for the question. We're always very careful with measuring output parameters because innovation is a strange beast. Yeah? If we're honest, innovation starts where the work of universities finish, when we start making products, commercial transition, etc. And so it's a joint effort. Yeah? And so that's why we, on purpose, are very careful with output parameters, because it's a different thing making innovation from a university in Munich area, yeah, with BMW and many other companies in your surrounding, than making it in a region where the only true and complete innovator is the academic institution. Yeah? And I don't want to geographically localize that, but I think that, you know, it's a different story. Yeah? And so I think we have to be very careful with output parameters. Output parameters are always a product of university multiplied by the local environment, industry engagement, business angels, financials, and etc. And so we cannot uniquely attribute it to the universities. Yeah? And that's something to bear in mind. It doesn't mean that I want to chicken out of output parameters, but we have to be careful in how to evaluate them. And that's something which we need to work in the future, perhaps jointly with industry. Yeah, it's something which it's never a product of us alone.
So we've got 5 more minutes for question. I've got Toril right there, and then I've got Pirita in the back.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for a very, very interesting presentation. And I'm Toril Hernes from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. I'm also part of the expert group, so we discussed the results. But I would very much like you to comment on the start of your presentation, where you actually comment that so many of the university actually have a strategy on innovation as compared to, for example, 10 years ago or so. So there is a kind of change and development in the sector that, and based on your experience, could you say something about a kind of movement within the sector when it comes to contribution of innovation?
Well, again, you are more of an expert than I am. You're from the expert group, so I'm sure you've got a good answer to that. But I think that from my short personal experience, it's been quite amazing to see indeed the move. And there probably are many reasons for that, some of which are policy driven, funding driven. You see indeed that governments are indeed, and we're seeing that right now with the European Commission also, pushing much more towards innovation. What we have to be careful, though, when we see that happening, is, as we're saying, and I didn't stress it maybe enough among the recommendations, is that we cannot forget that even if there's a bigger push on innovation, what's feeding innovation is the long-term basic research, the fundamental research. So when we call for funding, I think Michael said it very clearly, it's not just for innovation, but it's also for the research and innovation. The basic research is one of the fundamental engine that will feed in the innovation there. So not sure I responded as an expert, but Pirita, and then we'll take a question probably from Frederick, but we'll have to shortly move to the panel. I don't want to take away time from the panel. That's going to be quite exciting. Pirita, introduce yourself and...
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Pirita Lindholm, Director of ERIN, the European Regions Research and Innovation Network. This was really an excellent presentation, Stefan. I really enjoyed it. Just going back a little bit to the last point that Commissioner Gabriel made, I was wondering, because you have put the recommendations to European national policymakers, it would be interesting to continue the discussions and see what are also the recommendations to the regional policymakers. So I think this is something that I would like to continue discussing with you and your expert group, and maybe we can then find a way also to continue the discussions in the ERIN context together. So more an invitation to go forward with these recommendations further and see how we can kind of put them in place. Thanks.
And to be very honest with you, I wish we could, with the results, break it. So we've now looked at the results in an aggregated manner. There are some countries where we could go and look at a country. I think one suggestion from DG Regio has been to look at regional, but not in your sense. We're talking about EU 13, for example, and seeing if we see differences. We will probably not be able to go to the nuts level, but that's certainly something we would be more than happy to speak about with you, especially now that we go into in-depth analysis. I think we don't have the means with this sort of data to go, but I think that it will be interesting indeed to look at the regional perspective, because the recommendations, you are absolutely right, are also about the regional. And when we talk about regional, it's all the actors in the ecosystem, not just the universities or the policymakers.
Hi, my name is Stephane Berghmans from AEC, the Association of European Higher Music Education Institutions, but I have a very general question, not related to music. First, thank you very much for this presentation with this very valuable findings. My question, you explicitly mentioned the impact or the significance of Erasmus+. I was a little bit surprised because I would rather have expected that it's talk about Horizon, because if I research innovation, I would not first of all think about Erasmus, which is first of all about education. So could you say some words about that?
Well, I cannot say much than what I said already. I think that to us, it was indeed a surprise too. We were not expecting that. But again, starting to look into it, and maybe we're going to take a bit more time to explore that, keep in mind that we'll be able to potentially go back to some of those who were surveyed and try to find out a bit more. We haven't had the time, I have to be very honest. But the explanation we understand right now is that what Erasmus Plus offers is actually something about learning and teaching, which is perceived very much at universities to be a means of implementing innovation, at least when it comes to entrepreneurship, but also innovation within the learning and teaching. And then the other element, as I was mentioning, is how we've seen in the results that collaboration between universities is a key element anyway in what universities are doing to do innovation. And they do that more than collaborating, unfortunately, with the private sector. But Erasmus Plus allows that sort of collaboration. And so that's how we're seeing it now. But again, it's an early stage, and I think that's something that when we redo this survey in a few years, first, I'd love to see where the other instruments sit. I expect EIC hopefully will be higher. And otherwise, see how, asking other questions to nail down maybe a bit better what it is about Erasmus Plus that they find so interesting and good for funding, for the funding of innovation. Good. Pim, I'm really sorry. We're at 16. We have to move on. I really don't want to take away too much time, but more than happy to talk to you afterwards. Now we have the great privilege of having a great panel. Oh, sorry?
One more question here.
Frederick, quick.
I can make it very quick. I want to build on Michael's questions and Peter's perspective. I comply with Peter's perspective, but I think that we need to be cautious in deploying output indicators, and I agree with that. But I also see the need for universities to more clearly display our value. We will not get a greater responsibility than society sees that we deserve. So we need to get in there, I think, to find ways to display our value, our impact, and we cannot take full responsibility, that's for sure. But we need to demonstrate that we contribute, and we need to tell stories on how that happened. If we succeed in this, we will be able to attract the resources we need to be credible and strong players in the future.
Great. It was a comment, not a question. I don't need to answer. Wonderful.
Thanks.
Thanks, Frederick. So in that case, it is a privilege, I think, we have today, especially in the current conditions, to have 4 panelists joining us actually from very diverse backgrounds. We've got Annick Castio, who's director of University Namur, but also actually a member of the EUA Expert Group on Innovation Ecosystem. We've got Anna Panagopoulou from the European Commission, who will be joining us. I think you're the only real local participants today. We've got Diego Pavia, who's the CEO of EIT InnoEnergy, who will bring us also the private sector's perspective on this. And then we've got Leda Bologna, who's from the Emilia-Romagna region, and she will bring the regional perspective. And all this will be orchestrated and moderated by the chair of our expert group on innovation ecosystem, Professor Peter Haring-Bolivar. Can I please ask you all to come and sit? We'll move this away. I'll let you do that.